And we're live. Okay, cool. So we are going to pick up where our series left off last time, and we're going to work on implementing forms in React today. So I have made some changes to this repo, so to ensure that you have the latest, anyone following on the video, you can check the actual repo. The repo will be up to date, but these are the updates to the README, so you all have that there. And then the major change from last time is that I've created this poseForm.js component. This is the component we're really mostly going to be working on today. And so I'm just going to go ahead and slack out. This is really just boilerplate setup for right now so that you don't have to write out the whole form. So I am going to slack that out as well. So call this poseForm, yes, poseForm.js. And you can create this right in your components folder. And this is the boilerplate that'll get you all ready to rock, and we can focus on the meat of the functionality today. And then the last little change is that I added a little bit to app.css, which I've now lost because I overwrote those. Well, not a big deal. We'll address the styling as it comes up. If it's really hard to see what we're doing, we'll add in that CSS. So everybody good to go for right now? Okay, cool. And then everyone go ahead and run npm start in the repo so that we have our app running live and we can check our changes and stuff like that. Cool. Well, it looks like we have this. Let's refresh that. I think this is from when I had it loaded up before. Cool. So just to do a quick recap of where we were last time, we have this application that's making a fetch for some data on the app level, which is a bunch of yoga poses, storing those on state as data, and essentially rendering a list component, which is our pose list here. Then we map through our data set. So for every pose object in our data array, we render a pose element. And then that pose is basically just rendering the name of the pose, the image associated with that pose, and the description of that pose. So that ultimately amounts to what we see here. Last time I think we worked on implementing this little delete button. It's not data persistent, meaning it's not actually interfacing with the API to delete things, but we can delete stuff from our local view. And what we're going to do today is implement a form to add a pose to this list. We're also going to stay away from interfacing with the actual API right now because I need to update this API. It's an API I created myself, and there isn't a good post route for it right now. So that maybe we'll cover another, next time anyways. Cool. So everybody open up this pose form. Actually, sorry. Let's look at our objectives. So our objectives today are to implement a controlled form in React. We have some sub-objectives for that. We need to bind input values to state, and we need to handle changes to those inputs, which will also modify state. So we're going to kind of work on that wiring, which is very different than the way that most of you have been working with forms, where you create that form data object and then get values out of that. We're going to do it the React way now. And then we'll handle form submission to modify state in the appropriate place to add this new pose to our list. Any questions on our objectives before we dive in? All right, cool, let's do it. So we have this pose form component. Ultimately, what this is going to turn into is having a label and an input for each, for the name of the pose, for the description of the pose, and for the image of the pose. And so right now, pose form is just super boilerplatey. There's not much going on. It's just kind of the shell of a form. And just a constructor, nothing on state, although we'll very much be working with state. So if we go back up into app.js, and please follow along with me as we do this part, let's import our pose form now. And so I'm just going to copy this line, select these two, and change this to pose form, since it lives right in components next to the rest of ours. And that should give us access to the form. And do those of you in here recall how we use some of this conditional rendering to show like the loading bars, like that quick loading and that before the data is available? Some familiarity? No, not familiar with that. All right, I think for right now, I was gonna maybe make a button that you could click to toggle the form viewable and not viewable, but I think it's more important right now to focus on the form itself. So let's go down to our render method in app.js, and right below the header and above our list of poses, we'll just put the form right there. So it'll always be at the top of the app. Now, if you were implementing this in the real world, you'd probably have some routing going on, and you click a link that takes you to a whole nother page of the app. Since we don't have the router yet, too complex for right now, and we'll probably do some follow-up lessons on React Router specifically. But for right now, let's just render that pose form. And we don't need to pass it any props right now. Let's just see if we can get it to render on the page. So, cool. Looks like it's working. It's not the most beautiful thing in the world. We are basically just rendering some text right now. Put label and input here. Those are just my placeholders for the code that we're actually going to write. Cool. Everyone good so far? Have this little form sort of what will become a form rendering? Okay, great. So what I'd like you to do actually now is open up the documentation on forms. When I slacked the objectives out, it's this link right here. It's their official documentation, and they actually have like really good docs and a pretty good breakdown of how to implement forms, at least the basics of it. So I'm going to throw 3 minutes on the board, and I'd like you to read through this section on forms. They talk a little bit about how forms need to be done differently in React, and then focus on this controlled component. Please do read this first part, but focus on this controlled components here, because this is kind of a new concept we're introducing in terms of now having state perhaps in multiple places in this application. So a good solid 3 minutes to read through. You can stop when you hit this text area section. We don't need to worry about that for right now. Cool. And I'm going to go grab my charger. Yeah. Got about a minute and a half left for reading. And if you finish early, jot yourself down some notes about what this concept of controlled forms is. About 30 seconds left. All right, last few seconds. Awesome. Now, we don't have a ton of people in here, so what I'd actually like to do is just get thoughts from everyone, like one takeaway on why we do things a little differently in React with what this concept of controlled components means. Any takeaways that you have from this section of the docs. And what I'd like to do is I'm gonna give you a good 30 seconds to just think about it and jot down some notes, and then we'll do a quick whip around and have everyone chime something in. Actually, so let's do another minute to think, and maybe jot down some notes, and be ready to contribute to a little group discussion. So the question again is, what's one important takeaway from this section of the documentation? Or alternatively, in your own words, what is a controlled component? About 10 seconds or so left. All right, I'm going to stop this before it beeps at us. Is that enough time to collect your thoughts a little bit? Okay, cool. So I'm going to go back to our README. We'll make a little section for some notes here. And I'm just going to start on this side of the room. So Fionn, can you give us some of your thoughts? What is a controlled component? What's an important takeaway? Yeah, cool. So we tie or bind, and I'm going to put that in bold here, the state of the form to the state of the component in this case. Awesome. Andre.
What I see between here and JavaScript is there are two methods to handle the event.
Mm-hmm.
The handle submit, which we submit in JavaScript, but there's also handle change.
Yes. Nice. Great takeaway. So Anders observing that in the example that they show you, which is actually a really good example, we have this handle submit method that we're kind of familiar with that pattern. We need to submit the form in some way. But we also have this handle change method. And this is actually really key to be able to control the state of the form on the state of the component and create this actually character by character feedback loop so that every time someone inputs something, we are updating our state value for that. Cool. There.
To figure out that I thought it was really detailed was the handle change. So could actually update it in real time as soon as the stuff changes. Yeah. So as soon as the event happens, it changes right away, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to make a note specifically for handle change here. Handle change, let's do this. We have an event listener that updates state basically in real time. And this is a very different pattern than we've seen before, right? Cool. Graham.
Anyway,
that's okay.
Honestly, kind of the same thing Garrett was saying. And correct me if I'm wrong, but back when we were using vanilla HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you could, for example, set something where you have an input and you hit submit or whatever, and it would return it to lowercase or to uppercase, whatever it was. But it required that. Now you can basically do it where it just essentially does it right from the get-go in real time. It doesn't require any kind of user input.
Yeah.
So it happens in real time and it allows you to control the state of the component without the user doing anything.
Yeah.
Basically, completely based off your code.
Yep, totally. We could almost get away, in a sense, without a submit button or if we wanted to just be writing to state, we can take care of that with this handle change method that we'll work on. Awesome, great observations. So let's do it. Let's put it into practice here. So if we look back at pose form, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to get one of these wired up, and then I'll give you guys some time to implement them for the other sections of the form. So let's look back at the docs, and we see we've got a label here. We've got this input. And so actually, I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste right here. So I'm going to copy this whole thing and paste it right in here. And oh, that doesn't look great. Let's fix that indentation. Cool. And their example, we see now that we're working within a class component. Actually, let's take a quick step back and talk about why we're in a class component. So we've really been preaching to you that hold all your application state in app.js or some higher level component in the hierarchy so that it can pass down and coordinate. We're now, and with the caveat that like, oh, well, sometimes you do want to have state elsewhere. So we are now hitting the point where it makes sense to have state elsewhere in the application. So it makes sense for our form to control its own state so that it can keep track of all the changes to the inputs. But does the rest of the application need to worry or care about what those inputs are, like what the values that are being input? Not really. They're not essential. No other component is depending on this particular information to do its thing. Once we submit it, we're going to want to pass some stuff back up and change state on the app level to add the new pose. But to actually keep track of the values of these inputs, we really don't need that. And if you had an application where you had a bunch of different forms, it would get really messy to keep track of all of those on the app level state or on a higher component level state. So this is very appropriate for this component to control its own state. So if we're going to have an input for, well, in their example, they're really only keeping track of the change of one value at a time. And in our README, if we look at our objectives, we're gonna work on handling changes to input and state, but we're gonna do it in a nice programmatic way so that we don't have to write a different method for every one of these inputs. So, but if we need to, oh, here we go. If we need to keep track of the name, like if we're gonna input a new pose, it's gonna have a name, a description, and an image URL. So this will be the input for the name. I'll leave these here for now. So if we're going to track the name, what do we need on state? What do I need to add up here? Name, yeah. Nothing too fancy. And I'm just going to initialize it as an empty string. You can go ahead and follow along and do this as well. And then if we're also tracking description, I'm going to throw a description on here. We'll initialize it as an empty string. And we'll also keep track of image URL. I'm capitalizing U, R, and L because that's what the API is written for. We'll make that an empty string too. And just to show you a little bit of what I'm talking about, I think we have some logs of the data. So the reason why our inputs are being called name, description, and if we scroll over here, image URL is because that matches our API's data. Cool. So we initialize state. Really, there's no data happening right there yet. And let's tie the value. Well, so right now, actually, this .state.value doesn't exist. I'm going to cut this out. And if we go back to the app, we can interact with this form, right? We can do stuff. But we're not storing that information anywhere within the application. And that's why we're moving from uncontrolled to controlled form now. So to control it, first thing we need to do is give it tie its value to one of our state values. So if we do value is this.state.name, and you can follow along with me right now if you want, but you don't have to. I care more that you're just observing what I'm doing. Now, this name is tied to state. Whoops, let's refresh that. Did I save it? .state.name. Cool. So now it is tied to state, but I can't input anything. Any guesses as to why that's the case? If we look back at the code here? What? Yes. Yes, we need an onChange method. So let's cut that out. Whoops, that's too much. We'll cut that out. We're still not going to be able to change this input because it's now bound to state. So if the value is an empty string, we can't make it anything other than an empty string yet. So here's where this onChange method comes in. Whoops. So we'll do onChange equals, and then we'll just give a method a name that we'll write later. So we'll do this dot handle change. And if we check the documentation, we see that they have a handle change method written. So let's just go ahead and use that. Get our spacing a little better here. Cool. So it's taking in the event, and it's using the event.target.value. If we go back to some of our vanilla.js DOM stuff, onChange is an event just like onClick. So there's an event object, and we can access the current value of the thing that is changing with event.target.value. I actually like to write this a little more declarative and do const value equals event.target.value. And then when I set state, this needs to go back one, I just do value, that kind of thing. And in this case, our value is the name, right? We want to change the name key. We want to change this property on state. So we'll set the name to be the value, the new value. So let's see if this works. And then the event is passed implicitly, so we don't have to like declare the event down here. Cool. Whoops. So let's see what we get. Nothing. Hard refresh. Still not working. Let's see. We getting any errors here? Oh. All right, let's open this up. Errors? Give me something. Interesting. Can't read property set state of undefined. We're in a class component. Let's see if we can just get this to log something. Cannot read property set state of undefined. Interesting. Oh, I've done a bad job of binding this event. In the docs, they show you examples using binding in the constructor. What's our alternative way of doing that? Fat arrows, yes. So let's make this a fat arrow function. Cool. Sweet. Now I think this is going to work. The dangers of copy pasting from the docs. Okay, cool, sweet. We can now change the value, and you can see we get hello world logging every time we enter a character. So this event is firing, as Derek was saying, almost in real time we get updates. And if we were to log this .state in here, let's do that. Well, it's going to be one state behind, but that's okay. We will see that as we enter characters in, our state is indeed being updated. It's happening super, super fast, super slick. This is part of the slick user interface benefits you get from using a framework like this. Awesome. So, yeah, we'll leave this for right now. Question, yeah.
Why did you declare this handle change function inside this post framework, not inside the app?
So I did it inside of here because the state that we want to change when we set state is actually this component state. We don't want to change state up in app.js like we're mostly doing. And so any methods that we write up here are, if we use the fat arrow syntax or the bind in the constructor, they're going to be bound to the context of this component. So if we call set state, from a method that we've written here, it's going to be trying to change the state of this component. And in this particular case, we just want to modify the state of our form. Great question. Does that make sense? Because that's really important. Methods that we want to change the state of app.js, we write and bind there. Methods we want to change the state of another component, we write and bind there. Cool. Yes. So, actually, I was going to have you like fumble through trying to implement this for the next section, but I'm just going to show you my own little pocket handle change thing that will work for just about any form. And you only have to write this method once rather than, like I said, a separate one for each input. So the way I like to do this is I attach a name to each element in each input. So the value is bound to state. The name, I'm going to make the key on state that we want to change. So the name of this one will just be name. And we can access this through the event as well. So this is just an attribute like you usually have on form inputs. And what we can do here is we have the event.target.value. We have the value that we want to set, but let's make this now more dynamic so we can use handle change for all of our inputs. So let's do const key equals event.target.name. So this is going to resolve into the string name. Value will be whatever the latest value update is. And then when we call set state, I'm going to break this onto a new line so it's a little easier to read. We can use this dynamic value of key. And how do we set a key dynamically? Because if we were to just type key, then it's going to, it's just going to set key on state. What's the syntax that we need to use if we want to basically pump a variable in there? Not curlies, but regular brackets. But yeah, you're on 100% on the right track. So this will resolve into whatever the name of the input that triggers the change is, and the value will be whatever the newest value is. So bring back the log of this dot state, and we'll see this in action. I mean, it's it's going to just work as it did before, I believe. Cool. Yep. So we've got the same thing going. But now this function or this method is very generic. So it'll work for any input that you properly give a name and properly bind a value. Okay, I've been talking a lot. I want to set you loose on implementing this for the next couple sections here. But are there any questions before you dive into that? Okay, cool. I'm going to do like 3 minutes on the board. See if you can basically wire this up so that you can capture state values for description and image URL as well. Cool. We'll do 3 minutes. And I'll be walking around if you have any questions. Actually, I'll leave that handle change function up there. You can leave out the console log if you want. It's okay if you don't do the label, but obviously you definitely need to do the input.
Shift D, duplicate the line for yeah, and then put that Command D, do Command D anywhere on the key. Oh no, sorry, just click your cursor right on it. Command D, select that word, Command D, select again, so it's the next one, and now you can just change it. So easy, right? Great.
I think it's the same as the VS Code.
Well, I use VS Code with the Atom shortcut, so yeah.
Import it
Import it and then pump it in. Yeah, I am. And like, we're definitely not going to have time to get into the submitting it part, so we'll focus on binding today, and we'll do the submitting, and maybe I'll update the API for a real post for next time. About 15 seconds left. Is this enough time? Do you guys want more time? Okay, let's do another minute. And I'm gonna come over there if y'all have questions. Let's do 2 minutes. You can always stop at that a little bit.
Yeah, what's up? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's outside.
Okay. So the name is not a React thing, it's just like a regular HTML attribute, kind of like an ID or a class. And we're basically storing the information about this resource on the input itself, so you can access it through the event platform. It has nothing to do with React, it's just like if you were writing a regular form, it's good practice. It's basically like a table form. Yeah. You want the name on the left side. Yep, that is it. That will be able to pull that value. Yep. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We were watching some Facebook developer videos.
Cool.
I like 20 minutes too, so it's not
Every day you come up with an excellent shirt. I was really kind of sorry. No worries. Act like I know.
This is one here.
Yes, never. You really those 8 shirts. So I have a shirt like
Well, it's almost like it's in a
you said like street type
right?
Oh, yeah, that's excellent. Oh, I see.
We're about out of time. I'll come over and help you guys out some more. Cool. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're probably not going to have time to cover every objective, but let's move back to take a look at them. We're going to kick handling form submission back till next time. It's probably more appropriate to cover that in one lesson anyways. But we've been working hard on binding our input values and handling changes here. So let's do a little bit of review on that. Actually, you know what? I don't have the latest updates. So in the remote plat channel, can you all Slack? Can someone Slack their code for the description input, and someone Slack their code for the image URL input, please? Actually, everybody just Slack if you got an input working. Slack it out. Cool. I'm going to grab Fiance here for the description. Please do Slack your stuff to that channel, though, while I implement this. So if we go back to our pose form here, I'll bring back. Actually, let's hide that.
I'm going to go ahead and just paste what Fionn had. We'll put it right in there. Pull back our spacing a little bit. Cool. Looks good. So Fionn has wired up in a very similar way. So we're tying the value of this input to one of our values on state, description in this case, and we're essentially just using the same onChange method. And for this particular one, we need to set the name to description so that this method can properly use it as the key. Sweet. Let's try it. Oops. See what we got here. All right, we've got our name. Let's try that. That's still working. We've got our description. Cool. So sweet. Now we're controlling the values of the name and the description. And as you see, every input is actually updating state with this handled change method. And since we've written it to be generic, we can use this for, we could have 20 inputs on this page, and we can handle all of those changes with one method, which is awesome. Question?
So, is this like, so when you like say fill out your credit card on the form online and knows that it's not the credit card, or you can tell the credit card is just like this stuff you need. This is how they do that. Like it's almost done as you're typing it out.
Yeah, so they're probably, so Derek's asking if you're filling out a form and you need to fill out like credit card information or something that gets validated in some way and does it as you're typing. Yeah, they're probably using a front-end framework or some implementation that allows them to know every character, and then they probably have a helper function that in the at least in the case of like a credit card number, let's say, that as you input checks against some database each character to be like ensure that it's valid as you go. Or so they probably are tracking each character. Anytime you get that kind of instant feedback validation, that's what we call validation, form validation. They're somehow controlling every input. I would guess, in most cases at least. And that, like, again, we're getting back to some of the benefit of React or Vue or any front-end framework is this really slick kind of like instant feedback thing. And you can also do stuff like if we, instead of having like put label here, if we wanted to, we could just bind this to state also. So this section could just be render this dot state dot description, let's say. And we'll refresh. And now as we type, we get it showing up on the page somewhere, which you can all imagine how difficult and how much more code it would be to implement that kind of a feature without a framework. Yeah, sweet. So, I'm gonna check the channel again. Graham's got the section for image URL. I'm gonna grab this. Awesome. Actually, I'm gonna grab Derek's just because he has that label tag. So let's throw that in and ensure that this is working. Man, I don't know why it always kind of gets wonky with the spacing there. Maybe. Okay, name, Matt, description, awesome. Image URL, no images on internet. Sweet, so we now, all images removed. Sweet, we're controlling the name, we're controlling the description, we're controlling the image URL, and you could keep going, right? However many inputs you need on your form, you've got them really properly controlled. Sweet. So if we go back to our objectives, the next piece is handling form submission to modify state. So that's kind of a meaty one, and we've got lightning talks coming up in about 10 minutes or so. So I think we're going to kind of wrap right now, but I'd like to open it up for questions, comments, like see if we can identify any areas with binding values and handling changes that y'all are feeling right now. Any pain points? Yeah,
Can you go back real quick and show how you did it where you type things in the description and in real time it populated?
Yeah. So let's go back to our form. Sure. Let's go back to our form and let's actually just,
you just put it in a section.
Yeah, let's just make a new element. Like we'll make a paragraph and this, or you know what, we'll just do like a H3, let's say. So it's kind of big. And yeah, we'll just dynamically pump in this .state.description. And since everything is wired up and bound correctly, we can get that instant feedback going. So, as we type, we see the input right here. And like I remember when I first learned Angular actually, and someone showed me how you can work with this data binding, and it like blew my mind at how relatively easy it is to implement in a framework versus like thinking through how to do it in vanilla JS or jQuery or something like that. Good question. Any other questions? In the code? Yeah. Yeah, so I just made a little H3 below the form, below the heart of the form, but before the submit button, and just pump in the value from state. So this could, we could do something like H1, whoops, come on, cooperate. H1, this.state.name, and then let's say two H3s, and pump in the image URL. And now, oh, it's not doing it. Hard refresh. And now, as we type in, oh, I screwed up typing awesome. That's not awesome. Still no pics. So yeah, you can have some fun with the apps that you make, where like having a little piece of input here and rendering it over here. It's cool. It's cool. But it's all possible because this is now a controlled form, right? It's a form that has its own internal state that we're keeping track of actually every character change to. And this could be super useful if you could even send requests to your API on every character. And that's how you get nice functionality, nice UX. Like, I just filled out this form, but I hit the wrong button. And you go back to the form. It sucks when all your form data is gone, especially if it was a long one. It makes you want to just kind of rage quit right then and there. If you're tracking, if you're properly controlling those values and potentially sending them to a backend, then someone could come back to that form and it'll just repopulate it with all these values. Yeah. Any other questions? Can I get a quick fist to 5 on how confident you feel in being able to bind inputs to state in a form? Okay. And same for handling these changes, whether it's with my generic method or writing a method for each one. Okay, cool. Let's just go over them both again really quickly. So binding these input values. So the way that forms work, any input, any text area, or the way that any form works is that it has to have a value. Whoops, right here. And normally you can just leave this blank or not even declare it. But when the input changes, it's changing this value property, this value attribute. And that's how we can use the event.target.value to always grab that. So the layer that we're adding in now, like this input would still work if we got rid of this. If we get rid of this value and we get rid of the on-chain, well, let's just leave that and see what happens actually. So this is on the name one. Let's see what happens. It might, so it is changing name, but the value isn't similarly bound. So the handled change is actually kind of taking care of most of what we wanted. But if we look back at their docs, they really want sometimes you want default values, partially because like this form, like I mentioned the functionality of you leave a form and you come back to it and you still have all your inputs in there. That would be impossible if we weren't binding the value, because this form could be receiving as part of its initial state whatever the previous state of the form was from the backend. So we could have a component did mount method that goes out and fetches this whatever user's logged in, fetches their their form inputs. So instead of initializing state as an empty string, state could be initialized from that GET request or receive something from props. So if we had name Matt in there, we don't have it bound. Like imagine that this value just came from the API. We were using some data persistence. We got this value. We still have no initial starting value, so we can't get that nice functionality of having previous data loaded in if we're not binding the value to state. Does that make sense? I think I may have just made this more confusing. But so if we bring back the value here, on-chain should still work. Now our initial value is going to be pre-populated with Matt. So if you were in the midst of filling out this form and had to leave it for some reason, but your values were still properly being controlled, then you can start back up where you left off. It's sort of like just two parts of the same coin. We wire up an on-change method to modify state with every key press or every change of the input, however it happens, and we wire up the value to receive from state. So this is some of that data down, actions up that you may hear us talking about. So our input is receiving some data from state, and then when it changes, it's firing this action that changes state. So we're creating this loop, essentially. And the form can still work in some ways without having both parts of the loop, but it's really ideal to have it wired up like this. That way you can have some initial starting values if you need to, or have defaults that are just empty. And we'll cover this. We'll cover this again next time for sure. And then let's just walk through the handle change method once again. So I think this one can take a little time to wrap your head around. It's a little more digestible if you look at their example from the docs, where they're only controlling the value of one input. So their handle change method just sets the value. They're actually storing this as value on state. And when it changes, it just pulls from the event.target value. I think where this one gets more complex is introducing the idea of setting the key dynamically. So you could potentially have a method that's like handle name change that would look more like this. I'm still going to make a constant for the value equals event.target.value. And then you would call this .set state, which takes an object, and you just hard code the key, and then pass in pass in the value that it's changing to. So the extra layer of complexity that we're introducing is making this key dynamic based on the target's name. And the event target in this case is this whole element. And that's what lets us pull the value, that's what lets us pull the name out of it. And let's actually make, instead of logging this let's log this state, and let's log key. Or no, let's just log event.target. And this will be the last thing that we cover here. So, come on, hard refresh. I saved it, right? Yeah. So, event.target you see here is the whole element. And that's how we're accessing the name here. It's just some information that we're storing on the actual HTML element so that we can pull it out dynamically. All right, any final questions? And again, if you have questions and confusion from this time, bring them till tomorrow or Friday or whenever we do the next one, because we'll do a recap of this, and then we'll work on actually sending some data to the API and updating our internal state. All right, thank you all so much.